All right, you guys. So we are back once again. If you do have some questions, make sure to ask me various questions throughout this game. We're going to be covering the match between Nils Grandelius and Magnus Carlsen, played today in the Tata Steel Masters Tournament, round number 6. All right, so the game starts with E4, and Magnus obviously on +1. He's having a decent tournament, not great. So he decides to play C5 rather than being more solid with pawn to E5. So C5, knight F3 is played here. Knight to C6 by Magnus. D4, trade. And now here Magnus plays E6, which is the first big surprise. Obviously, Magnus is very well known for playing knight to F6 here. And after knight C3 playing E5 and playing the Sveshnikov setup, he's done this many times, most prominently in the World Championship match against Fabiano Caruana in 2018. Anyway, Magnus decides to play E6 this time. Knight C3, queen to C7. Now, perhaps Magnus's idea was to draw upon some inspiration from the game between Nils Grandelius and Richard Rapport, where Nils played 6G4. Nils did go on to lose that game, so he obviously didn't want to repeat that, and he played bishop to E3 here. So now A6 was played by Magnus, and Nils played pawn to G4, changing the order just very slightly by throwing in bishop E3 first. So knight takes D4 was played here. Queen takes D4 played by Nils. Magnus plays B5. Again, Black really would just like to play on the C file. Ideas like B4 exist here with queen takes C2. Also bishop B7 and rook C8. And then you put pressure on this diagonal towards the rook on H1. And additionally, you have B4 as well to undermine the knight and then create the weakness on C2. So castles is played here by white, by Nils, and bishop B7 by Magnus. Nils plays F3 here, trying to consolidate his chain here. So basically now by playing F3, all these pawns, both E4 and G4, is solid. Whereas if you go back here, as I said, their ideas like B4 and E4 could become a little bit weak. Knight F6 also potentially hits both the pawns. So F3 is a very nice move as it protects all the pawns in the center of the board. Rook C8 played by Magnus here. And now Nils plays queen D2. Of course, if you were to play, say, a random move like H4, you would actually lose the pawn B4. Because now if you move the knight, there's queen takes C2, which is checkmate. And I guess if you don't move the knight, you just play king b1, pawn takes knight, and you're down a piece here. So queen d2 is played by Nils. Idea being that now if b4, you can go knight a4. Idea knight b6 to attack the pawn on d7 and the rook on c8. Additionally, the queen guards the pawn on c2. Also, after queen d2, Magnus plays bishop b4. Now, at first glance, it might be like, oh no, there's this big pin, you're going to lose material. For example, say you play a move like a3, after bishop takes c3, let's just say pawn takes, black can play a move like d5, and black is much better here because you have the double pawns, your queen side is very open, and you're in a lot of trouble. However, after bishop b4, white has the very nice move of playing bishop to d4, so you guard the knight, so if black takes, you recapture with the bishop, keep the pawn structure intact, no weaknesses, and when black doesn't take and he plays a move like f6, or actually, sorry, and additionally, you're also threatening to hit the pawn on g7, so black sort of has to deal with this bishop move, which is very dual purpose or multi-purpose. So f6 is played here by Magnus. Idea that basically you stop the threats on the diagonal, and you also maybe prepare pawn to e5 at some point to force the bishop off of this diagonal and then capture the knight on c3. So g5 is played here by Nils, and now Magnus plays h6. Now, it's worth noting that e5 is maybe a move here, and it's really interesting what Nils would have done. At this point, I believe he was still moving pretty quickly, but after e5, let's say you take the pawn on f6. If black were to capture the bishop, you'd win the game because you can take on g7. And after d takes c3 here, you have a very tricky idea with queen takes d7 check, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, and now if black captures, you make a new queen. And after black takes on b2, you simply quietly go king to b1, and after bishop to c3, you still make a queen. Black recaptures, and now you just take the bishop on b7. Now you have two rooks and a bishop against a rook, a bishop, and a knight here. So this is completely winning. So after e5g takes f6, however, black does not have to recapture the bishop on d4. Instead, black can play knight takes f6. And now you can't capture the pawn on e5 because after queen e5, the knight guards the pawn. And if you move the bishop away to, let's just say, f2 here, black can now play a move like queen a5. You have serious problems because of this pin. There's also d5 in the center as well. So everything is extremely weak for white. So after e5, white has to play a move like bishop e3. And now computers, of course, say this is completely fine for black with either moves like f5 here, for example, or even a move like pawn to d5. So it's really interesting whether this was prep from Nils or what was going on. Magnus obviously was not in his prep, and so he wasn't sure about exactly what was happening, so it's understandable. But from Nils' perspective, I do wonder what Nils' idea was here, because the computers do say this is completely fine for black. So after g5, Magnus plays this move h6 here, and now Nils takes on h6. Another rather strange move, perhaps, because you would figure capturing towards the center, say g takes f6, knight takes f6, and a move like rook g1 seems more logical, because you might put more pressure on the g file. Of course, as you guys can see from the bar, this is not objectively correct, but we're trying to look at ideas and themes more than specifically move by move. However, Nils chooses to take away from the center, and the reason this is also very weird is because after knight takes h6, black now has a safe pawn chain here in the center with g7 and f6, and the bishop isn't really doing anything, and you can't really create threats along this diagonal. So a3 is played here by Nils. Very logical move, because of course black is also threatening to play pawn to e5 here. So a3 is played, and now Magnus takes. Now again, there are a couple options here for black. Bishop takes a3 is one. Black can also take on c3, but after bishop c3, white is just much better here, because again, this diagonal, there's still maybe some long-term threats. You also have rook g1 to undermine the base, and this pawn on d7 is also a weakness here. So Magnus plays bishop takes a3, and you might think, well, after ba3, what's going on? Magnus is just down a piece and losing. However, he has a tactic here with pawn to e5, and the idea is that if white now moves this bishop away, let's just say bishop f2, black in fact can capture the knight on c3 here, because after queen takes d7 check king f8, cannot capture the bishop on b7, because queen takes c2 is simply checkmate. You don't really want to move the bishop here, and I really do credit Nils. He finds the best move, which is a computer move, which is he figures, you know what, this knight on h6 is out of play. There isn't a lot happening in the center. I want to see if I can somehow keep the bishops on bishop pair alive here without giving up too much material. So he plays knight takes b5, attacking the queen on c7, and after a takes b5, he now goes bishop b2, and he somewhat protects his king here on c1 with the bishop on b2 guarding a3, and maybe later on a move like bishop d3 or something like king c1 and rook c1. But the king is a lot safer here than, say, a position like this after, say, bishop f2 takes here, and you'll look, the king is very open. You have two weaknesses on c2 and a3, no protection around the king, so you really don't want to go for that. So knight takes b5 is played here, a takes b5 is played, and now bishop b2 played by Nils, d5 played by Magnus. Now Magnus here realizes there's some danger in this position. If he's too slow and passive, let's just say a move like bishop c6, after rook to g1 here, you cannot castle the king because the queen takes h6, and you would be unable to capture the queen because of the pin, and you would lose the game. And if you play a move like king f7 here, for example, white is just much better. I'm not sure the cleanest way to win, but something like h4 followed by queen to g2, and there are a lot of threats on the g file. You aren't really attacking on the c file, and white, technically speaking, should be winning here. That being said, Magnus plays an interesting move. He plays this move pawn to d5. Now, it's worth noting that during the game, a lot of people felt that he mistimed the order, because if he had played knight f7 first, bishop takes b5 would not be with a check, and after bishop takes b5, black can play a move like bishop c6, and if you trade, white is up a pawn, but the bishop is not great on b2 here. It's very passive. Black has a very consolidated pawn structure here as well, so black should be fine. Instead, Magnus plays d5. Bishop takes b5 check is played by Nils, so temporarily up a pawn, but as we will see, there's a lot of play. So here Magnus had an interesting choice, king f8 or king f7. Now, one thing that's really important at the upper levels of chess that I think a lot of people do not realize is that sometimes it's not purely about calculations. And one thing you'll notice in some of the videos I've done with the analysis recently is I'll talk about a theme or a move, and it might be losing. You might see a bar stay flat and jump out of its mind when I explain a theme. And it's worth noting that at the upper levels, it's not purely about calculations. It's also about trying to figure out logically which squares the pieces belong on. So in this position, the computer actually likes king f7 the most, but after bishop to a4 here with the idea of bishop b3, it feels very dangerous for black with this king on this diagonal. Additionally, there's one other point, which is the knight on h6 is stuck. It cannot get into the game here because both the f5 and g4 squares are completely controlled. So to his credit, Magnus goes king f8, realizing that A, the king's not going to get attacked on this light square diagonal, and B, much more importantly, he can bring this knight into the game with moves like knight f7 and knight d6. So bishop a4 is played by Nils. Now again, when we look at this game in retrospect, After queen b4, king g8, the computer does say after queen b3, white is much better here, because now you can no longer push the d pawn, because that would put your king in check. And after knight f7, e takes d5, knight d6, the computer says after rook d3, white is probably winning. Again, without knowing the objective evaluation, it's very hard to go into this as white. And even if this had happened after a move like queen f7, I'm not so sure that Nils would have won this position. So bishop a4 is played instead. Now Magnus plays d4. He creates the connect 5, so it should be game over here from h8 to d4. More importantly, besides just using a funny meme theme, the pawns are very solid here, and white cannot break the chain. If you go c3, of course I take, and you just lose the game. You can maybe try f4, but even if you get some position like f4 in trade, I still have the chain intact. So because of that, the connect 4 chain is very, very solid here, and your king is kind of a little bit weak on c1, so black has some serious counterplay. So after d4, Nils plays bishop b3. Idea to try to cut the king off to where it cannot, where it's basically stuck on f8. Knight f7 played by Magnus. Now here Nils plays queen b4, and this is sort of the start of going wrong, but I can't really critique Nils because at this point, the correct move for the computer is to play h4 for a couple of reasons. First of all, it stops knight g5. Secondly, you can maybe go rook g1 and queen g2. You can also maybe go king b1 and c3 at some point. Again, very tricky, and I can't really fault Nils because queen b4 is a natural move, because what it does is it forces the king onto this long diagonal from b3 to g8. So after king g8, rook to d2 is played by Nils, and this is sort of where I won't be super critical of Nils for what he played, but I think he underestimated the danger after this bishop a6 move. Now you might think, well, what's this really do? It doesn't really do a whole lot. There actually is a very nasty idea to play rook b8 and try to make this queen very, very uncomfortable here. Say, for example, I'm just going to play a random move like rook f2, rook b8. You can no longer retreat with the queen to like d2 or e1, because then I take the bishop and you can't recapture because of the pin. So what happens here is your queen is now, you tried to attack the king to put pressure on it, but you're actually in a situation where your queen is getting shifted to the side of the board and ending up a little bit further out of play. So f4 is played here by Nils. Rook to b8 played by Magnus, and now Nils plays queen a4. Bishop to b5 played here. Queen to b4. Only move, by the way. You cannot move your queen anywhere else. The queen is just stuck on a4. Otherwise, all the squares are covered. a8, a7, a6, and a5 are all covered here. You will lose the queen on any of these four that you go to. So queen b4, only move. Bishop a6, queen a4, bishop b5, queen b4. And one thing that you'll learn, especially in the European school of chess, is that generally if you get a position where you can repeat moves at least for 2 times, make the repetition, gain a little bit more time, and refresh your mind, reset it, and then look for something after that. And it's very important to note that you should go for these ideas if you have the opportunity, especially if you're low on time. So rook to h3 played by Magnus. Now in retrospect, computer actually says that after bishop to e2, queen to a4, rook to h3, black is winning because of the pressure on the bishop on b3. And if you play a move like king b1 here, now I can go bishop b5, queen to b4, and I can play rook takes b3 here. Take with the pawn, I check, a clean fossil, rook takes d3, rook b4, and queen b7, and black is winning, especially with the right triangle. And if white, say for example, plays a move like bishop to e6 here, the computer says again you can go bishop b5, queen b4, and rook f3, and black should be winning. As I said before, very difficult computer lines, not something that I would expect a human to find, let alone a situation where both players were low on time. So here, after queen b4, Magnus plays rook h3, also a logical move. You want to move the bishop and put the same pressure on the bishop on b3. So here, f takes e5 is played by Nils, and now Magnus plays f takes e5. And in this position, I was actually very surprised. So I remember looking at this live, I thought the obvious move for a human to play is this move rook to f2. Try to put pressure on the knight on f7 in this position. Again, another right triangle as well. And if black plays a move like bishop to e8, for example, after queen c4, white is completely fine because you're going to double stack on f2 and f1. And there's a lot of pressure on this diagonal towards the king on g8. However, Nils chooses to play rook g1, which is a very surprising move to see in this position, but a logical one with the idea of doubling up the rooks on the g file and going after the pawn on g7. So now Magnus plays the move bishop to e2, and Nils takes on f7 here, and Magnus captures. Now, again, very difficult position, very hard to be critical, but the computer does say that if black plays bishop a6, in this position, white can't go queen a4 because rook takes b3 again. After bishop takes f7, you have the remarkable idea of going king to h8. Not queen takes f7 because then you would lose the rook on b8, and not king takes f7 either because then white has a tactic or a theme which we'll see later on with rook d to g2. So in this position, after bishop takes a6, bishop takes f7, king h8, there's another trick here which my good co-commentator on this event, Benjamin Bach, also known as the Puzzle Rush Wizard, found as well, which is this very tricky idea with rook to g3. And the reason that this is so tricky is because if black takes the queen, rook takes h3 is very simply checkmate here. And if you don't play rook takes b4, let's just say you trade and I take, again, you cannot capture the queen because rook h2 would be checkmate. And if you take the bishop, I very simply take your rook on b8. However, after rook g3, black can play the move rook to h6 here. The rook guards the bishop on a6. It also covers all the checkmate ideas on the h file. And the computer says that, let's say you play a move like queen a4 here. After queen takes f7, black is winning because you have dual threats of queen f1 and also queen to a2 here. But again, very tricky, very hard to find, especially with limited time on the clock, so you cannot be critical of either player. So after bishop e2 is played instead of bishop a6, bishop takes f7 here, and now Magnus takes. Of course, queen a4 is the only move here. Any other square, you lose your queen. Queen b7 played, and now queen b4, only move. You cannot go queen b3 check, trying to create the right triangle and trade queens, because then oopsie daisies, my rook on h3 eats your queen on b3. And you cannot move the bishop because then queen b1 would be checkmate. So the only move here is queen to b4. The pawn holds the queen, and you're hanging by a thread. So again, we get another repetition. Both players low on the clock. Queen c7, queen a4, bishop to b5. Now here, Nils plays the move rook d to g2. A very nice move. Creates pressure towards g7. So if you take the queen on a4, I take with check on g7. The stack is solid. King has to go to, say, f8. After rook takes c7, material is even once again. So very nice move by Nils to find this, and Magnus here plays this move rook h7. Now again, very tough position at this point. With both players a long time, it's a logical move. Computer says after king e8, rook takes g7, queen takes g7, rook takes g7, bishop a4, rook g8, king e7 takes, rook takes h2. Black is maybe a little bit better here. But even in a worst case scenario, white should be able to play rook b4, bishop takes c2, bishop d4, e4, rook takes d4, and make a draw in the rook and bishop versus rook endgame. However, rook h7 is played here, a very logical move. Queen to b3 check, played by Nils. Gotta save the queen, bishop c4, and now he finds queen g3, which is a very nice move because it creates the legendary gun on the g file. And there's also another point here, and I don't know if Magnus missed this during the game or not, but if you move the king back to g8, I can now take the pawn on d4, and you cannot recapture because then you would lose the queen on c7. And now white is simply winning because all this pressure towards the king, the 3 stacked pieces, bishop is also opening up the diagonal as well. It would be game over. So queen b6 is played here by Magnus, and now Nils plays queen g6, forcing a queen trade and going into an endgame. So they trade the queens, and Magnus plays rook c8. Now, initially, you may say once again, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. White is up a pawn, and white should be much better here. However, hold up, because if you look at the pawns, black has a chain here, but beyond that, white has what we call pawn islands. You have 4 pawn islands. All the pawns here are absolutely split. They're not connected whatsoever, so they're little islands, and as we know from island drift theory, when you have islands, that's not a good thing. All right. So we go back to suspicion after rook to c8 here. We get rook g5. Now, this is a mistake here. In retrospect, after the move king to b1, this would have been a pretty routine draw because after rook takes h2, you can go rook g7 and you're fine. And if you don't take on h2, let's say you play a move like bishop e6. Now, after a move like rook to g2, white is completely fine here. So after rook c8, here Nils makes a mistake and he plays rook 6 to g5, which I'm kind of confused as to why he played it. This was his 40th move, to be fair. He'd been under a lot of pressure, and he probably felt like, I just have to make this 40th move. But now it gets a little bit tricky because there's this move, bishop to d3. Now you deal this pin on the c file from the rook on c8 towards the king on c1. Additionally, all your pawns are very loose. h2 is loose, e4 and c2 are also loose. Now, rook f5 here is played by Nils after a very long think. Again, at move 40, the players got additional time. C3 was the move that I would have preferred. Again, no criticism here because obviously these moves are very difficult to play. But if he had played c3 after d takes bishop a1, this would be probably a pretty routine draw, because now black no longer has a chain, and you're going to win some pawns, either c3 or e5, or maybe even g7 long term. And probably the best black has here is bishop takes e4, rook takes e5, a move like rook c4, but after rook to g4 here, if black goes bishop d3, you can just trade and take, and this is obviously a draw. And if black, say, plays rook h2, you just trade the rooks, rook h1, king c2, rook a1, and after king c3, rook takes a3, king d2. This is actually still a draw, although there is a more precise way. There is probably a more precise way of playing this, which is in this position after rook takes h2. I think, well, I assume there's a more precise way, although I guess maybe not. Maybe this is the best you have. So this might be a good reason why Nils turned it down, because after king d2, rook f3, this is actually a drawn position, because you can go king e2, rook f6, and it looks like the king is cut here, but this is actually very simply drawn. So you go rook g4, rook to f5, and now you can just move the rook, I believe, to g3, and if black goes g5, you exchange the rooks. If black goes king f6 here, again, you kind of just sit and wait with rook g1, and after g5, you can go rook f1. Classic distant opposition here, where you go king g1, king moves up to f4, you go king f2, king moves to g4, king g2. If king e4, you go here, g2 again, f4, f2, and opposition. So maybe in retrospect, I'm a little bit off in how simple I thought the draw was after c3, but I felt it was a little bit easier, because after rook f5, king g8, there are some serious problems here. Rook to f2 is the only move to guard the pawn on c2. Now rook h6 played by Magnus, great move, understanding that the idea of the double stack on the c file is very potent. Additionally, the e4 pawn is very, very weak too. The rook to d1 is played here by Nils, and now Magnus takes. It's worth noting there's a very beautiful variation which actually wins here. King b1 is a very human move, expecting bishop e4 and say rook e1. But after king b1, there's a very nasty tackle with rook takes c2, rook takes c2, rook takes h2. Now initially, like, wait, there's a pin, so black's winning. Then you're like, wait, no, just rook c1, white's up a bishop and winning. However, after rook to c1 here, you'll notice that white can't really move the pieces. So after black plays g5, white is simply lost. If you ever move the king, you lose the rook. Of course, if you move the rook, you lose the rook here. So you can't move the rooks, can't move the king. Pawn is glued. So you really only lose the bishop or the pawn. And after you play a4 here, black just goes g4, bishop to a3, and now black plays rook takes c2, rook takes c2, g3, and the pawn is just free. It's running down the board. You go king c1, bishop c2, and there's no way to stop it. King c2, g2, g1, queen, and black wins the game. So you do have to be very careful here, which is why, again, Magnus is always looking for those little ideas and those little tricks in the endgame. So after rook h6 here, rook d1 is played, and this is where Magnus makes a surprisingly dubious decision. Now, the move he plays, it doesn't lose the game, it only draws, but still, it was very surprising considering the reputation Magnus has that he did not go rook f6. If he had played rook f6 here, I suspect that Magnus would have won this game. And the reason I say that is because if white takes on f6, you can play rook c2 check, king to b1, and now rook d2, king c1, trade the rooks, and take on f6. And Benjamin Bach and I discussed this endgame with the opposite color bishops, but after a move like a4, bishop e4, you do have the wide peepos. The pawns are split wide on the a and h file, but black does have 3 connected in the center, and black probably is winning in this endgame, although this is definitely something that should be in a Dvoretsky endgame manual. So bishop takes e4 is played rook e1 here. Again, like I said, I'm very surprised he didn't go rook f6, but he took on e4, rook to e1, and now after rook h4, a4 is played by Nils, realizing that here the bishop is not well placed on b2. You need to activate it, so a4 activates the bishop, and additionally, you can also run the a pawn up the board as well. So rook c5, bishop a3 is played, and now Magnus kind of realizes that the advantage is gone, and now the next couple of moves are pretty just straightforward. Rook to c8, bishop to e7 is played here. Rook g4, h3 by Nils, trying to undermine the bishop here. Rook cannot stay on the 4th rank. If you go here, you lose the rook. And if you go rook f4, we just trade and take. But black does have rook g2 here. So now you cannot capture the bishop on e4, because then you lose your rook on f2. So they trade, rook takes e5, d3 is played here, bishop c5, rook a8 by Magnus, takes, rook a4, and now just a couple of final customary moves, king d2, bishop takes h3, rook to e4, and here they agree to a draw. Of course, they can just trade the rooks. Opposite color bishops, only 1 pawn on the board, and the game simply ends peacefully. So in retrospect, there are a couple things I would say. First of all, a little bit surprised by Magnus's opening choice. I don't know if he confused the move order. He just thought that he could outplay Nils with sort of the setup that he did. Obviously, it was somewhat dubious. I suspect Magnus did not realize just how dubious it was until it occurred on the board. So kind of dubious. At the same time, later on in that middle game, I do feel like Vintage Magnus probably would have won this game somewhere around this moment on move number, I believe it's move number 24. Somewhere around this position, Magnus was up 30 minutes on the clock. And I feel like in Vintage Magnus, he would have been able to press on the clock, exert more pressure than he was today. So I feel that there were definitely missed opportunities for Nils, maybe minor missed opportunities for Magnus. I could think this is a huge miss because I do feel like he should have won this position most of the time from this middle game position that he had. All right, you guys. So we are going to move on from our analysis of this game between Magnus and Nils. I hope you enjoyed the commentary. If you didn't enjoy it here, you can definitely find it on YouTube and watch it as well. Do I genuinely enjoy these game reviews, or do you do it more for educational? Sort of a mix. I enjoy doing the reviews. I do enjoy the educational content. Obviously, I don't do a lot of that, so it is fun to do it here and there.